Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar on the links with ageism and abuse in Northern Ireland. My name is Sarah Browne, and I'm the Vice Chair of Hourglass and the Northern Ireland Trustee on the board of Hourglass. And for those who are joining us who haven't joined our previous webinars, just to let you know that Hourglass is the only UK-wide charity which is dedicated to calling time on the abuse, harm and exploitation of older people. Abuse of older people is now at epidemic levels and urgent action is needed so we can work towards creating a society where older people feel valued and can age safely without the fear of abuse or harm. Older people need to have access to specialist support services, and they need to be given equal opportunities and recognition. It is estimated that probably somewhere around 2.7 million older people in the UK are victims of abuse, which is a staggering figure. And this figure is set to rise with our ageing population. Yet older people's voices are rarely heard. Our research shows that older people are often left voiceless and isolated, and that we need to make sure that going forward their voices are heard to ensure that they can receive the services and the support that they need to age safely. In Hourglass, we run a 24/7 helpline service offering advice and support to older people. And we also provide casework services, which you will hear a little bit about later in the webinar. This morning, we're delighted to be hosting our first webinar from Northern Ireland with all of our panelists joining us on this morning's webinar who live and work in Northern Ireland. But before setting the context for this morning's webinar, I would like to go just through very quickly some housekeeping. This morning's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who is registered for the event. So please share this recording with your colleagues who maybe have been unable to attend this morning, and as widely as possible. Part of our aim within Hourglass is to raise awareness in all areas. Please sign up for our newsletter, which will keep you updated about events and future webinars. And please follow us across all our social media channels and comment where you wish, because we do like to get feedback. After this morning's webinar, you will be sent a very short questionnaire, and I would urge you to please take a few minutes to complete that, because we really value the feedback that we get from delegates. Please also take the oath, which is about pledging your support for creating a safer ageing society by 2050. And as we go through the webinar, if you have any questions or anything that any of our panelists raise and you would like to ask a follow-up question, please put that into the question and answer, and we will try to get to all the questions. We have left 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to focus on picking up any questions. But before introducing this morning's panelists to you, I'd just like to set the context really for this morning's webinar. For some time in Hourglass, we have held the belief that ageism creates a petri dish for abuse, harm and exploitation of older people to thrive. Indeed, the World Health Organization notes that ageism is the most socially condoned form of prejudice. Every person will grow old, and every person who grows old is likely to be the target of ageism at some point in their life. Whilst age is one of the 9 protected characteristics that cannot be used to discriminate against someone in England, Scotland and Wales under the Equality Act, we have more limited protections afforded to older people here in Northern Ireland. We also believe that older people, as victim survivors of abuse, are still misunderstood, ignored, under-researched by policymakers, and until recently, virtually invisible in data collection. This morning, we will have, I suppose, a facilitated discussion with our panelists who will address many of these issues. I'm sure I will put forward a number of questions to our individual panelists. But as I said before, if any of you have any questions that you would like answered, please do put them into the question and answer section. I would now like to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and to say a little bit about their particular interest in this work before we actually get down to posing the first of our questions this morning. And if I could go firstly to Claire and then to Kathryn.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to join this webinar. My name is Claire Sugden. I am Northern Ireland Assembly's only independent MLA. I've been in that role for just over 10 years, 11 years. I have a particular interest in advocating for the rights of older people, and that's an area that I've always prioritised since I became an MLA back in 2014. That led to the setting up of Northern Ireland Assembly's first all-party group for ageing and older people, which I currently chair. That brings me right up to today's kind of work in relation to that. So I am advancing and hopefully we'll get legislation in relation to age discrimination in Northern Ireland. We're the only region of UK and Ireland that doesn't have age discrimination legislation in the area of goods, facilities and services. So I'm really keen to talk about that with you and why it's so important and how it does link to abuse, because I agree if we are not if we're not giving a focus to our older people, if we're not giving that dignity in every area of their day-to-day lives, then it does give rise to neglect, to abuse. So it's something I'm interested in. It also connects to a previous role when I was Minister of Justice, when you were action on elder abuse, and the work that we had to do in relation to that. And it always frustrates me that we nearly look at it differently to other forms of abuse, to forms of domestic abuse, which doesn't give it the focus that it needs. So really looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
Thank you, Claire. And Kathryn, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, and thanks to Hourglass for having me along. I'm Kathryn Barr, Senior Policy Officer at the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland. So the Commission has a range of statutory remits in relation to age, particularly under the employment legislation, things like working towards the elimination of discrimination, harassment, promoting equality of opportunity. We have responsibility for the public sector equality duty here, which is known as Section 75, and that includes the duty on public authorities to have due regard to the need to promote equality of opportunity between persons of different ages. To be honest, we would like those powers to be expanded. As Claire has alluded to, the discrimination provisions in Northern Ireland are really lacking around age-based discrimination. So we would like to do more in this area from a public policy perspective. For well over a decade, probably closer to 2, we've been calling for stronger protections against age discrimination as a priority for the executive here. And there's a wider range of work in relation to things like domestic abuse, like hate crime, and like prejudicial attitudes, where we've been calling for change as well. So really looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say and the Q&A session. So thank you.
Thanks, Kathryn. And I'll pass over to Veronica.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Veronica Gray. I am the Deputy CEO and Director of Policy for Hourglass. I've been with the charity for 10 years now, wearing a variety of different hats and undertaking different responsibilities. And I think this morning is really positive for us as a charity. For a start, it's great to have a Northern Ireland focus to one of our webinars. It's something that we will be doing a lot more of, having those nation-specific in-depth conversations that allow us to really look at the nuts and bolts of what's happening in each part of the United Kingdom. So I'm delighted that Kathryn and Claire have joined us this morning, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I think ageism and age discrimination is such a huge barrier and is so intrinsically linked, as you've said, Sarah, to abuse of older people, that there's so much to unpack. So looking forward to this morning's conversation.
Thanks, Veronica. And then I'll pass over to Aisling.
Morning, everyone. My name is Aisling McGuire, and I am Frontline Services Officer for Northern Ireland, and I work mostly with a lot of casework, dealing with any older people, dealing with abuse and helping them through those stages. I also on the helpline a lot during my week, and helping with anyone with any sort of concerns related to an older person, and helping them through that with advice.
Thanks, Aisling. And thank you to all the panellists. I think you should now have a good overview of our panellists. So I'll begin the discussions this morning. And my first question I'm going to put to yourself, Claire. And you've referenced it in your introduction, but you've launched a public consultation on new legislation to tackle age discrimination. Mm-hmm. This is a crucial step towards closing the gap in Northern Ireland. Equality laws, which, as we've pointed out, are falling behind the other nations. Can you tell us about the current challenges in Northern Ireland, and particularly more about your private members' bill?
Sure. Yes, so the idea to legislate around age discrimination didn't begin with me. As we heard from Kathryn, it's been going on for nearly 2 decades. I think originally the Executive Office had consulted on it 15 years ago. And regrettably, the political parties couldn't come to an agreement to take that forward into law. So it's kind of sat there stagnant ever since. And when I became an MLA 11 years ago, it was actually one of the issues that came up quite a lot, particularly even from a constituency perspective, that we need to put age discrimination in the areas of goods, facilities and services into law. And despite lobbying, despite the sector, consistently calling for this, it still hadn't happened. So when I was elected in 2014, I made it part of my manifesto that if I were to be successfully elected, I would take it forward as a private member's legislation. And I suppose there's opportunity with that, because if the political parties don't agree as an executive, it can't go forward. Whereas as a private backbench member, I don't need that agreement. I can progress that myself. So where we're at with it is the public consultation has closed on that, and I have prepared a final proposal to submit that to the Speaker of the Assembly. He will then take the decision whether I can get support in drafting that legislation. So I would hope that will happen within the next few weeks, months. And if that happens, then I'm at the stage where we're essentially writing the law. And when we get that done, then we put it into the House. There is a nervousness around completing this before the end of the mandate, because obviously if we don't get through every stage of that, the bill can fall. And I think given the fact that the Northern Ireland Assembly began its mandate 2 years in, we have lost that precious time. And it's not even just the case of me progressing that as fast as I can. I'm competing with other private members' legislation. I'm competing with government legislation as well. And we're about a year and a half until the next election. So I'm doing my best to try and progress it as much as possible. But there is a reality that a lot of private member submissions in Northern Ireland will not pass. If anything, probably less than half of those that are being proposed. So there's a challenge there because of the structures and the time and the general issues in relation to Northern Ireland politics. But it's a bill that we got a fairly good response on in terms of the public consultation. There seems to be a general consensus that we need it. I think all but one submission said that we didn't. I suppose that one of the reasons as to why it didn't progress initially was the starting age of the legislation. Do we legislate for all ages, or do we legislate from 16 plus, 18 plus? Again, the public consultation suggested that we do it for all ages, but I appreciate that there will be political objection to that. So my intention is to submit it and then let the House decide and vote on it appropriately. I suppose my biggest concern is that would stop us getting this legislation in place, which it is critical, and particularly for older people, because it's those who affects most. But generally, I would say that it's a positive step forward for older people in recognizing their rights, because right now in this area it just doesn't exist, and I think that in itself is very telling. So,
thank you, Claire. And just before I move on, I mean, can you give us a sort of a quick summary of the stages that a private member's bill has to go through?
Yeah, absolutely. So it begins with a proposal, and then after that proposal, you draft a public consultation. So that's usually about a dozen questions that you put out to the public, and that process can take about, well, up to 12 weeks. After that, you have a summary of that consultation process. So it gives you an indication of where the public are in relation to it, and not just the public, stakeholders, the sector, play a really valuable input to that. So the Commissioner for Older People would have contributed. The Equality Commission, Kathryn's represented to here, had submitted a really important contribution to that, and gives a lot of detail to it as well, because to an extent the general public won't understand the legislation. They won't, get the jargon that goes with all of this, and the background and the context and the other laws that we compare it with. So it is important to have that kind of informed contribution as well. And then after the consultation, I submit a final proposal. The Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly will decide whether it's within scope, if it's within the competence of the Assembly, which it is. And then it will be drafted, and when it's drafted, it will be submitted into the House, and that's when the fun part starts. So the first stage is there on a blue paper. Second stage is debating the general principles of it. So why we need this, why we don't. It then goes to the committee, which is, this bill will fall within the Executive Office Committee, which I coincidentally sit on as well. And then when it gets past the committee stage, it'll go into the Assembly for what they call consideration stage, and that's when we start getting into kind of the nuts and bolts, that each sentence, each word. Passes that stage, further consideration stage, final stage, and then hopefully royal assent. So there's a bit of work to do before we get it into law. But I'm working hard to try and do my bit in getting it there. But to an extent, I will be subject to the schedule of the Assembly and other competing interests. So
yeah, absolutely. But we appreciate all of your efforts in this field, as you can imagine. Thanks, Claire. And Kathryn, if I could maybe come to you and it sort of linked to Claire's sort of discussion there in the first question. Is there a worry that this legislation would impact on either individuals or organisations that support older people?
That is something that's come up in discussions, and I suppose just to allay any concerns, we would not, and my understanding is Claire would not want to see that at all. This bill is about protecting people and strengthening rights. It's not about getting in the way of good work being done by organisations like Hourglass. We would want to see specific exceptions for the likes of charities, for the likes of what's called positive action, which is where public bodies or organisations take steps to, for instance, improve the inclusion of older people. Maybe older people aren't using a leisure centre as much as other age groups. What can the council do to improve access? Those kind of things would be excluded from the law that we want to see. And more broadly, unlike other forms of discrimination, we would want to see ways that direct discrimination could be justified if it's proportionate. So that means basically that it's justified in the means. It's a proportionate means of meeting a justified end. It's not going beyond the powers that should be, and there's a lot of EU and European Court of Human Rights case law around that. And the other measure that we would want in that it should be meeting a social policy aim, so that it's not just a business doesn't want to serve older people because they think that will cost them too much for whatever reason, that there has to be a good social policy reason for it, that older people have particular needs, that maybe there's a scheme to tackle loneliness amongst certain age groups, and that would be completely justified under the legislation. So there's good, as I say, lots of existing case law around those kind of test issues. Going beyond, there's things like concessionary fares, so cheaper, maybe cheaper menus and cheaper services for older people. Things like the bus pass would definitely not be accepted in the legislation we want to see, because, as I say, this is about expanding rights and improving protections for older people in society. It's not about taking things away or treating everybody as exactly the same, when sometimes differential treatment is needed and is justified.
Okay, thanks, Kathryn, for that. And then if I move across, Veronica, to yourself, and Hourglass has published a policy brief paving the way for abuse and violence, which highlights how ageism can create environments where abuse can thrive, as we've mentioned before. What are the overarching themes of this policy brief?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, I suppose we're coming from our first point is that everyone grows old and older, but very often our notions about aging as a process are rooted in assumptions, stereotypes, and negative attitudes. So when the term ageism was first coined back in the 1960s, it was described as revulsion and distaste for growing old, disease, and disability. So right there from the outset, linking the ageing process with vulnerability, frailty, ill health, dependency, lack of worth, and the burden mentality. And those notions and outlooks clearly haven't really moved on and remain very much alive in society today. As you've said, the World Health Organization saying that ageism is now more pervasive than sexism or racism, and the most societally condoned form of prejudice. And that is very much borne out in Hourglass research. So in November 2024, we undertook some research and we found that 55% of people in Northern Ireland don't view ageism or age discrimination as a form of abuse or harm of older people, and around 20% of people here indicating that ageism or discrimination is not severe, which is clearly not the case. So against that context then, the policy brief really aims to explore how those negative attitudes can foster a sense of acceptance or normalisation of the ill treatment of older people, which in turn can become the breeding ground for abuse, neglect and exploitation. The policy brief will also argue that those negative attitudes enable society, professionals, the general public, all of us, to turn a blind eye to clear manifestations of abuse and hamper research and data collection on the issue. So I suppose really the brief aims to demonstrate that when older people are perceived as low value, other people feel more able to mistreat them with little accountability. And again, that's supported by our own research of the general public in Northern Ireland, which identified that 33% of people here don't think it's abuse to persuade a family member to change their will. 30% don't see taking money from an older person's bank account without permission as a form of abuse. 34% of people here don't see mugging an older person as abuse. And about 24% don't see inappropriate or unwanted sexual comments or acts directed towards an older person as abuse. So all of that gives us a really ripe breeding ground, or as we've described it, the petri dish for abusive older people to thrive. So we argue clearly that ageism and abuse are inextricably linked. We don't believe that ageism is the only risk factor for abuse, but we certainly see it as one part of the overall picture and something that we must actually challenge in order to raise awareness that abuse of older people happens, and then educate and prevent against that abuse taking place.
Thanks, Veronica, for that. And then moving across to yourself, Aisling, as a frontline services officer, what are the key themes coming forward from your contact with older people here in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so I suppose really with Northern Irish cases, and we do see this across quite a bit, that it's really maybe the abuse of an older person maybe isn't taken as seriously as maybe someone who would be younger or anyone else really. And it's even going back to some of the statistics that Veronica mentioned there, that it's just not really recognised that the abuse of an older person is happening around us and it's not taken seriously enough. And maybe there has been some examples of this with different cases as well, from maybe other professionals, maybe not seeing it as abuse, or maybe not understanding that an older person is going through this, and that it's not taken seriously enough, and maybe that they're fixating on this sort of, or they're mentally ill, or it's down to dementia. There's a lot of stereotypes around it. Not, of course, hearing that from maybe a professional or someone they've trusted to report this to. Maybe that's something that obviously doesn't help the older person to then want to take that any further. They feel undervalued, and that's really what we see a lot as well with older people. And so, yeah, the really lack of understanding that this happens to older people and that this does happen quite commonly.
Thanks, Aisling. And then, Kathryn, if I could maybe come to you, how do you hope that this bill that Claire is doing her best to drive through will improve the rights of older people in Northern Ireland?
Thanks. And I suppose the first thing to say on the back of those honestly deeply frightening for statistics that Veronica just said and what Aisling's reflected on, one thing would be that where there are public services that are not taking older people seriously, that are discriminating against them in a way that they wouldn't discriminate against younger people, there would be recourse there to come to the likes of the Equality Commission or to take a case themselves. There would be protections. At the minute, there's not necessarily those protections in place under equality law. We're really pleased to see Claire taking this bill forward, and are keen to support her however we can. As I say, it's a scenario we've been looking at for a long time. We mentioned jargon earlier. If I refer to AgeGFS, that's our shorthand for this legislation, so age, goods, facilities and services. But I suppose it's important to say that it would expand into areas like shops and retail, banks, housing, public functions like the police, all of these, any services, bus transport, all of these wide areas. At the minute, all that's covered in Northern Ireland is employment and further and higher education. We think that having those clear legal protections for older people, that they cannot be unjustifiably discriminated against when using these services, will be really important, both symbolically but also as real practical rights. I've spoken to many older people over the last few years who recognise that the absolute unfairness that they're not included. It wouldn't be right if they were being discriminated against because of their sex, disability, race or any other ground, but for some reason they've been left out because of their age, and it is for some reason acceptable to discriminate against older people under the law at the minute. We've particularly highlighted the discrimination faced by older people in relation to healthcare and access to financial services. In this regard, we'd actually want to see the legislation go further than GB. Under the Equality Act at the minute, there's basically a carve-out for financial services. The learning from that, and I suppose one advantage of being further behind GB, is that we can see that that's raised significant concerns. with older people's groups there, that the discrimination does continue in financial services. So we would want to learn from what's being done in GB and other jurisdictions like Ireland and in Europe more widely, and to make this legislation the best it can be. To be honest, we're not expecting the courts to suddenly become full of lots and lots of cases. The lesson from GB is that there hasn't been great amounts of litigation. But what we would want to see is organisations, service providers, public bodies being forced to have a think. What does this mean? What will the requirements be? How do we meet these? Which I understand did happen in a lot of services around 2012 when the legislation was introduced in GB. But in all of that, it's important to say that the legislation by itself won't be enough. It won't change everything. There will need to be enforcement powers, and certainly as the Equality Commission, we would want to be properly resourced to make sure people are aware of their rights, to train service providers on what they have to do, and to provide guidance to them. And I think, and this will underline what we're all saying, legislation is something on paper. Tackling prejudicial attitudes needs more, and that'll take a wider government response across different departments and across public bodies and across society generally. So legislation is absolutely important, but those wider prejudicial attitudes will need tackle too to get to the root causes of discrimination.
Thank you, Kathryn, for that. And just following on from Kathryn's comments, Veronica, if I could come back to you, and again back to Hourglass's policy brief that you'd been discussing earlier around the key themes of the brief. But could you tell us what are the recommendations and asks from the policy brief? And what you would like to see happening?
Sure. Obviously, we want to see a culture where age-based abuse and neglect are as seen as unacceptable as any form of abuse against other demographics, because we need to see that the needs and rights of older people are protected, and that statutory agencies in their delivery of services are held to account, but also that government is held to account as well in terms of adequately resourcing the work that needs to be done. Like we know, for example, that the abuse of older people costs the Northern Ireland public purse about £46 million every single year. But we know that that could at least be quartered if services were adequately funded and we were giving older people the right support and had an additional focus on prevention of abuse. In terms of the policy brief itself, then, we are clearly supporting Clare's bill and are more than happy to continue to work with Clare and with the Equality Commission around the rationale for change. We definitely want to see training, awareness and education on these issues, but we also need to see government-backed data collection and research. We are asking for greater awareness of ageism and the devastating impacts when it's not addressed. We know an older victim of abuse is 2.5 times more likely to die or go into residential care within 2 years than their non-victim peers. Abuse in older age is life-threatening. So there is a clear need for us to address this. Now, we reckon this could be meaningfully delivered through a government strategy on ageism, maybe rolling out on the back of Clare's bill. We certainly want to see safer ageing and the rights of older people. The Hourglass manifesto is calling for a safer ageing society by 2050. And that's why we created the Oath campaign. Oath stands for Older Age, Tomorrow's Hope. And we ask you all to sign up and show your support for a safer ageing society. Recent NISRA statistics have identified that in 2 years' time, 2027, we will have more over 65s in Northern Ireland than people under the age of 16. So the time for action is clearly now. And as Clare and Kathryn have both said, this comes down to education and awareness. and adequately resourced organisations to deal with the issue. So those are our asks, as well as the challenge of an overarching safer ageing society and a strategy to tackle the abuse of older people that will run in tandem with the violence against women and girls strategy.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. And Claire, if I could maybe just on the back of Veronica's comments, put to you the question, do you think government is preparing for an ageing population?
No, I don't. Certainly not in Northern Ireland. It didn't originally feature in the draft programme for government, and it actually took lobbying from the sector and from myself to get it even mentioned. Now, that mention is better than what we had, but it's not substantive. It doesn't come with a set of actions or even progress. Now, to an extent, the programme for government in Northern Ireland was always going to be limited again because our mandate began, 2 years in, and it's not as comprehensive as it needs to be right across the board, and there's a lot of areas and strategies that are missing from it. But I suppose the bit where I'm, always keen to press is that preparing for an ageing population is not just about our older people. It's about public services generally. Our public services will look very differently in the context of an ageing population. You only need to go into an accident and emergency department and look at the people who are lying in the beds, and more often than not, it's going to be an older person. So when we talk about waiting lists, we have to take that into account, and through my work and chatting with local practitioners, hospitals, doctors, even primary care and health and social care, they recognise that this is what we need to do. I think the chief medical officer at a time, Chris Whitty, had said that if you want to improve public services across the board, you have to design them in the context of an ageing population, and we're not getting away from that. That's not me saying that we don't invest in our schools, but equally we're putting an awful lot of money into schools which sadly are going to close because the birth rates are not keeping them full. So I think we need to be more strategic and honest about that. And do I think our executive are doing that? No, because I do feel like it's like pulling hen's teeth to get them to even consider it. But we have, and we've got it there. And certainly my work as a backbench MLA is now that I have that point of reference where it is mentioned in the programme for government. I can keep asking the questions in relation to, well, what are you actually doing? My only hope is that it will follow through into the next mandate, and they can take a more, I suppose, substantive approach to it. But I think we can't stop talking about this, and every opportunity I get, I remind them of the consequences of not doing this, because I do fear that, public services in Northern Ireland are in such a mess that and I believe that's because they didn't strategically plan 10 years ago. So I would hate to see ourselves in a much worse situation in a decade from now.
Okay, thanks, Claire, for your comments on that. Slightly still connected, but maybe on a different area. I'd like to ask you, Kathryn, if you could give us an update this morning on the hate crime legislation and proposed sentencing review.
Yeah, so we have seen progress in relation to hate crime come fairly slowly here in Northern Ireland. Things have moved ahead in other jurisdictions like Scotland, which has included protections for age in their new hate crime legislation. That is what we would want to see here. And there was a judge-led review by Judge Marnin into hate crime provisions in Northern Ireland way back in 2019, 2020. And he called for age to be included in hate crime protections here. We are expecting some hate crime provisions to be included in a sentencing bill coming in autumn. That should strengthen our hate crime provisions, because at the minute they're much weaker than the other jurisdictions in these islands, which is great and will be really important for the grounds that are already protected, but age isn't one of them. And the Minister hasn't indicated that age will be included. She has indicated intersectionality will be included. So if there's a hate crime committed because of somebody's ethnicity and a disability, that intersectional approach would be taken, and that will be, we understand, be provided for in the legislation that will be introduced. But again, age isn't going to be included. So if somebody's subject to a hate crime because they're disabled and an older person, the older aspect of that won't be included. So we'll be continuing to raise that amongst other concerns. Our understanding is that reform to issues relating to hate in Northern Ireland will be taken forward in sort of a piecemeal approach. Originally, the plan was for one overarching piece of legislation to sort this out. I think Claire's already alluded to the shortened mandate we're in. So the minister's taking sort of, as I say, a step-by-step approach in different pieces of legislation. So this is the first step. As I say, we'll be continuing to call for age to be included. But we'll see where it goes, and there may be other opportunities to improve that protection for older people through the legislation at a future date.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn. And Veronica, do you want to make any comment in relation to the hate crime legislation?
Yes, we have been involved in the discussions around hate crime legislation in Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have been part of all of those developments. And I suppose we are obviously working in line with legislation in each nation. And we know that England and Wales aren't minded to take forward age as a hate crime. I suppose where my interest lies in the short term is around the sentencing bill, to see increased provisions for older victims of crime. For a long time now, Hourglass has really campaigned quite strongly to see appropriate sentencing. So I'll give you an example of one case that I was involved with. A woman in her late 80s was economically abused by effectively her daughter, and her daughter stole £12,000 from her while she was in hospital, ill and not expected to survive the illness. When the older woman, the victim of this crime, identified this and reported it to the police came out and said to her, actively discouraged her from taking the case forward, and said to her if she wanted to continue with the complaint, her granddaughter would have to have her mobile phone seized as part of evidence gathering, with almost an approach of poor child will be cut off from her friends. Now, thankfully, this older woman did proceed with the case. It did go to court, and her daughter was convicted. She was sentenced to 6 months suspended sentence and ordered to pay £500 victim compensation. Now, there was nothing in that entire scenario and through a number of months working with that family that I found just or right. From the initial act of abuse and the crime committed against this older woman, right through to the sentencing and how the woman was dealt with by the criminal justice system, there's nothing just there. And I don't think the sentence received was justice for the victim. I don't think it was sufficient for the perpetrator, and nor do I think it sends any clear message to any other would-be perpetrator that actually this is not wrong. In fact, another older person at the time commented on the case to me and said, when it comes to older people, it shows that crime really does pay. And I think that is such a terrible place for our society to be in. So that's why I'm really keen to see what can come about from the sentencing bill and from the hate crime legislation to see perpetrators held properly to account.
Okay, thank you, Veronica, for your comments. And before moving on, Claire, I just want to give you an opportunity if you want to make any comments in response to what Kathryn and Veronica have raised this morning.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I agree with Veronica. I do think there's an opportunity through the sentencing bill to address this. Indeed, that the when I was Minister of Justice in 2016, I had announced a review into sentencing, which, you know, I believe has now led to this work. You know, because there is dissatisfaction with our sentencing framework in Northern Ireland, and that the crimes committed are not reflecting that in the consequences of that. So, you know, I do think that's important work, and, you know, I'm very keen to work with Veronica, as I have done in the past, that, you know, if the original bill doesn't specify these things, there may be ways of doing that, because as a backbench member we can submit amendments to reflect that. So you've given me another piece of work there, Veronica, but you're happy to do it because you're 100% on it. So
okay, thanks Claire for that, and I'm sure Veronica will hold you to that, as you well know. Then moving on, and just from everything that has been said this morning, what is clear is that the media, and often the language we use, shapes how we view older people and how society views older people, and I suppose more specifically how we view the abuse of older people. So I would like to ask each of the panelists, really, what would you like to see change in this arena? What could change that would actually change the dialogue? And Veronica, if I come to you first and just go down.
Sure, of course. This is one of my soapbox topics. I do feel really strongly that we need to engage with the media and actually help them to move on in terms of the language they use. We've come so far in terms of our everyday racism and our everyday sexism, but we're not moving quick enough or far enough in terms of how we speak about older people. And Kathryn mentioned healthcare earlier. I did just happen to look recently at a couple of headlines from BBC News. Can drugs delay the disease of aging? So again, labelling aging as a disease, that's not helpful to anyone. Another BBC News article, the title was Coroner Warning Over Bed Blocking After Woman 91 Dies. Now, look at the language there, bed blocking. No one wants to stay in hospital unnecessarily. So why was that headline not focused on the actual story, which was why the fact that the woman in question delayed seeking hospital treatment due to a previous difficult encounter in A&E where she was waiting on a trolley for a number of days. So when we see these type of headlines, another one there, ancient Britain's population is getting bigger and older. These headlines fade into the narrative that aging is something distasteful. And we've seen this play out over recent years, the really toxic conversation around the Brexit referendum. And again, we've seen it, and we are still hearing it around things through the COVID inquiries, and the issues and the attitudes towards older people at that time. Those issues are not going to go away until we start challenging the everyday ageism and the language that comes with it. I personally speak to many journalists over the course of any given month through Hourglass, and they are interested in learning about our work. They are very keen to know and to help us tell the story. I suppose where I also then have a bit of a concern around the media is that they won't report on the story without the actual individual speaking to them and having that real case study. And we can't do that in Hourglass. We can't start re-traumatizing victims. And as I've already mentioned, many of our older people will actually experience life shortening as a result of the abuse, and their families, because most of the abuse that we deal with in Hourglass will take place within a family setting. It creates an additional barrier for example, a mum or a dad to talk about the fact that their son or daughter or grandchild has abused them. So these are the additional barriers and the nuances whenever it comes to dealing with the abuse of older people that I think Hourglass and others have a real strong responsibility to do that education piece with the media and sort of bring them on that journey with us. So to challenge the language, but also challenge how we actually do tell the stories through the power of the media, because that's how we reach the general public with these really important and crucial messages.
Thanks, Veronica. Kathryn, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Veronica's hit the nail on the head with a lot of that. There are clear, when you hear about ageing in advertisements in the media, it's how to avoid it. You know, as somebody in their 20s, late 20s, you're constantly being bombarded by this product, anti-aging product. It is to be avoided in all terms, and I think there's certainly a gender aspect to that as well. But it is how society talks about aging, unfortunately, and we're not seeing those real positive stories to the same extent. I think there's also issues, you know, in recent years, a lot of really good work has been done around maybe domestic violence in relationships, that is not just a private matter, that is not, you know, a domestic to be sorted out behind closed doors and shouldn't involve the police necessarily. I think there is still perhaps something in that family kind of abuse that Veronica is talking about, that it's a private matter, it's a family dispute, and it's, when it involves older people, it's not as serious. And clearly that's borne out by the statistics Veronica was outlining earlier. How that's addressed in practice is the trickier question. You know, what's been talked about in terms of a strategy to tackle ageism would certainly sound like a step forward. What government can do working with the media to tackle those attitudes. We've seen different campaigns from the PSNI and others around particular kinds of crime, like hate crime and others. What's needed to raise the profile of elder abuse, and so people know that they can report, and concerned family members know that there's a route to reporting through and speaking to the likes of Hourglass, that it's not just an internal family dispute, but it is abuse, and it is covered by domestic abuse legislation in many cases. But it won't be solved overnight, unfortunately, and it will take a lot of work from a lot of different agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is about raising that awareness and calling it out when we do come across it, as we do all the time. Aisling, anything from your viewpoint from dealing directly with older people and perhaps their families?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that's been said so far, and it really is about raising that awareness and recognizing what abuse is for an older person. Like at certain events, or even hearing calls on the helpline, older people are worried. They turn on the news, they see things that are happening with other generations, and they almost feel in a way undervalued, because the way they would hear things in the media, it's not the way that it should be. There is a discrimination there. So it's how that language is used appropriately and things like that. But yeah, definitely getting the recognition that there is somewhere for them to talk about what is going on, and whether it's in a domestic abuse circumstance, whether it's a historical thing that it's just coming to light now, and how they talk about it now, and how they deal with it now as an older person. Recognizing what that abuse is and talking about that is really important. Even at events and certain events in Northern Ireland, not maybe people not hearing of Hourglass or haven't heard of us before, really getting that message out that we are here and we are there to support and to talk through and to recognise that abuse.
Okay, thanks, Aisling, for those comments. And I come across to you, Claire, because obviously sitting in the Assembly and with your constituency office and feedback that you get, what are your views and what we could do to change the dialogue?
I suppose it's supporting older people themselves to recognize their value to society. You know, I think sometimes it can be an element of self-awareness, and it 100% comes down to what others have said. It's about how you're perceived, you know, what it means to get older. You know, do you have any value after you've retired? And absolutely you do. You know, in terms of caregiving, you know, my 2-year-old daughter is with my mother now, who's in her 70s, and you know, that's great for me, but you know, it's good for her too. But you know, I think we again have to recognize that older people do play a valuable part within society, and they don't just go away whenever they retire. And actually will plug a lot of the gaps that we're going to see in the future because of our aging population. You know, there's big issues in relation to the economy. There's big issues in relation to the workforce. Now, that's not as to say that, you know, all older people will want to do that, but where they do, I think we really need to, you know, allow them that space, and if anything, we need them. You know, and I don't think government or even society recognizes that. And older people themselves maybe don't, you know. So I think we just, you know, whether it's through community and voluntary work, whether it's through government programs, you know, supported events, that type of thing. I think we really do need to recognize the value of our older people, not just for themselves and the dignity that they deserve, but for wider society and the problems that are coming down the line if we don't do that. Aging population, we just need to plan for it. And yeah, I think when we do that, we might start to see better things happen.
Okay, thanks for that, Claire. And I would just remind everyone, I know Carrie has popped it into the chat, but if any of the delegates this morning have any questions that you would like me to put to any of the panelists, please pop them into the question and answer section, and we can come to that because we're nearing the end of the more formal questions. And just moving on, again, related very much to not just older people, but obviously very much to do with older people. The Adult Protection Bill that here in Northern Ireland we have been waiting for quite some time, and as we know, there has been a delay. But my question, and if I could maybe come first to you, Claire, because of the policy bit of it, how do you think that this delay has impacted the policy going forward around adult protection?
Well, it means we're not doing what, you know, we should have done up until now, and it is positive that that's finally that's finally happening. But again, you know, we have to put it into the context of whether of the impact that this will create on the ground. And like all of these things, it feels a little bit rushed even at this stage, because you know, we have been waiting for it for so long, but it has to be right. And it has to, and we have to get it onto the statute book. So it's good we've finally got there. But yeah, absolutely, there will have been an impact to that in terms of it. If anything, not having it up until now will have created more problems. So the problem's nearly bigger to address.
Okay, thanks, Claire. And Veronica, similarly to yourself in terms of the delay, but looking at it really from the funding aspect and the service provision for older people, what do you think the impact has been?
Well, like Claire has said, we are obviously delighted to see progression in terms of the bill. It is a very positive step forward, because for too long we have been relying on a regional policy which has been variously described as not fit for purpose, therefore creating a safeguarding and protection gap for all adults at risk or in need of protection, and from our view, particularly for older people. Obviously, we'll be submitting our consultation response at the end of this week. We're broadly supportive, but we would like to see a couple of gaps closed in the bill as it's proposed. In terms of the funding, Claire's right, this bill needs to be right, but it needs to be adequately resourced. I've already mentioned that the social and economic impact of abuse of older people is £49 million per year in Northern Ireland. Now, normally, a £49 million problem would be attracting every headline under the sun, would be attracting support of every politician in Northern Ireland, but yet it's not creating those headlines, it's not creating those policy responses, and it is certainly not creating ring-fenced funding for service provision. Hourglass has been operating in Northern Ireland for 10 years now, and that's really hard to believe. And despite that, and despite the thousands of people that we help and support on a yearly basis, we have never received a penny of support, financial support from Stormont. And that's not for the want of trying or the lack of engagement. You know, it was mentioned earlier on, funding needs to follow demographic change and service user needs. And we know there's never enough money. There's never going to be enough money. But that does not mean that older people can be treated less favourably than other age groups. Like we know, for example, core funding is what every charity wants and needs. It's absolutely vital. And yet the Department of Health core grant scheme was effectively closed to new applications for the best part of 2 decades, where organisations in receipt of funding did receive that on an ongoing, albeit reduced basis. But it was a closed shop for any new initiative, for any new idea, for any progress or development, or for organisations like Hourglass who are following demographics. So that effectively created a disadvantage in our local communities and for our older people. And that's an ageist approach, and it has to be called out as such. So I have every sympathy for organisations and staff and service users who have lost funding. We all know it's an incredibly crowded marketplace. It's an incredibly challenging fundraising environment. So we're all in that same boat. However, we do need to see tapered funding timescales. We need to see support for capacity building within charities. We need organisations to be adequately resourced and able to diversify. And we need to see multi-year ring-fenced funding for specialist service provision. We have to remember older people as victims of abuse face unique barriers, and I've talked about that already. Generic provision is not suitable and will not address the needs of older victim survivors. So those are some of the issues I think that we have in Northern Ireland in terms of resourcing. Now, Claire might have more information on the proposals to resource the Adult Protection Bill. I certainly don't have that, but we will be campaigning very strongly to see that that adequate provision.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. Okay, and I don't see, unless Carrie informs me otherwise, I don't think that any questions have come through from delegates this morning. But there's still time. If anyone has a pressing question, please do pop it into the question and answer box, and we will address it before the end of the session. But I suppose really at this stage, I would just like to ask our panelists maybe to share with us their closing remarks and I suppose the takeaway message that you would like to send out to those who are attending this morning's webinar, and indeed to those hopefully who will get the opportunity to listen to the recording of this morning's webinar. And if I could maybe start, Claire, with yourself, just for any closing remarks that you would like to make.
Sure. Again, I think it's just to reiterate that we need to recognise the value of our older population, and we do that across society. We do that in our homes. We do that via legislation if that's what's appropriate. Because all of us will get to a point where, you know, we are in our older lives, and, you know, looking back on that, we don't want to say that we treated, we wouldn't like to think we were treated, inappropriately. So, and as I said, we are an aging population. It's, whether people want to recognize the value or not, it's going to impact on all of us in not recognizing it. So I think for the greater good, for wider society, for public services generally, I think the best thing that we can do is see the value of our aging population, see the value of our older people, and start designing services, start, being strategic about that, because it will affect all of us. And not least, as well as, I say this and sometimes it maybe sounds a bit cheesy, but after a lifetime of giving in, I think it's only right that we give back, the dignity of living into older age. And I think realistically where we're at now, we're not doing that. People would, probably object to me saying that, but if we're not giving them the same rights, if we're not giving them access to the same services, if we're not recognizing that their life is as valuable as someone half their age, then we're not treating them right. So I think we just need to start calling that out, and I think we just 100% need to recognize that value of our older population.
Thank you, Claire. And Kathryn, if I could maybe pass across to you for some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I suppose building on what Claire said, it's so important that any legislation, any strategies, any policies have the voice of older people at the centre. I've been really privileged over the last few years to speak to many older people about the anti-discrimination legislation. And I can tell you it doesn't seem to me that there's other groups who are so au fait with what their rights are, where they're lacking, and to be very clear that they deserve the same rights as others. It's not acceptable that you can be discriminated in a shop because of your age where you couldn't be because of your race, your sex, your disability. Society needs to recognise that older people have the same rights and should be treated as such in the law, and older people should be facilitated to feed into that process. And that should be taking account of all of their intersectional needs, because we're talking about older people here, but that is certainly not an homogenous group. Older people, there's men and women, there's different sexual orientations, different ethnicities, different disabilities, and so on. So we need to take account of all of the varied and diverse needs of older people and reflect that in our legislation. But thank you very much for having me along today. It was a really useful conversation, and hopefully it'll continue.
Thanks, Kathryn. And Aisling, if I could come across to you for any closing remarks.
Yeah. So basically what's been said already, that like with it being an aging population, and we really need to protect everyone in that aging population as well. And really just being able to listen to people and understand any sort of concerns around that aging population, and really just it has been really positive conversation we've had this morning, I think, and it's something definitely to look forward to, and of course speaking with anyone and being able to encourage anyone to speak up about Hourglass or about safer aging and how we can help older victims of that as well.
Okay, thanks, Aisling. And then finally, Veronica, any closing remarks that you would like to make before we finish up this morning?
Yes, Sarah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Sarah, for chairing this morning's event. And thank you to Kathryn, Claire and Aisling for joining us. I've certainly enjoyed the conversation and I've learned a lot, and I think there's a lot more that we could take forward and explore. I suppose from an Hourglass perspective, we welcome the HDFS legislation and commend Claire on her work, not only in this, but for the past 11 years, her work in championing the rights of older people. It's crucial to see that legislation come through, because outlawing unjustified differential treatment based on age will help change negative stereotypes. We believe that negative attitudes towards older people create the breeding ground for negative behaviours towards older people. So we need to stop this in its tracks, and there's very much a prevention piece to be done there. I suppose really finally I would just like to again remind anyone around the Hourglass manifesto and our campaign to see a dedicated strategy for safer ageing in Northern Ireland to prevent the abuse of older people, and ask anyone who supports our mission to see that come to life to sign the oath and make that commitment. And I suppose finally, then it's just to reiterate what Aisling has said, there's a variety of ways of contacting us. Our helpline is 24/7, 365. People are able to get in touch. I think the email has been dropped into the chat as well. And we do have now a bespoke training offering that we are able to offer organisations bespoke training around all of these issues that fall under safer ageing and stopping abuse. And we also have some generic training sessions that we're scheduling on a monthly basis around abuse in later life. So people can check out the website on those points. And I suppose finally, just to say thanks to everyone for coming along this morning. And I'm hopeful that people got a lot out of it. I certainly did.
Thanks, Veronica, for that. And as chair of the webinar this morning, I would just like to add my sincere thanks to all of our panelists, particularly Claire and Kathryn, who are joining us from outside the charity this morning. And I appreciate how busy everyone is. And it's terrific that we have such strong advocates working outside the charity. And Claire, as you can imagine, will be watching very, very closely of the progression of your private members bill. I think it will be a game changer, and we just hope that time doesn't run out before we can see it come to fruition in the current mandate. And Kathryn, I know Hourglass work closely with the Equality Commission, and we would be fully supporting all of your work. As Veronica has said, this morning's webinar really was aimed at raising awareness, and the more that we can do that, and I suppose raise the issues, call out when we see things that are blatantly ageist and potentially giving rise to situations that can condone abuse or allow abuse to thrive, is very important for us. So when after this morning's webinar, the recording is sent to all of the delegates, please do think about who you might share the webinar with, because the more people we can get to watch the webinar, and I know it's not always handy for or convenient for people to take time out maybe during their working day, but please share as widely as possible, and maybe raise at staff meetings or in forums where you think like-minded people like yourselves might be interested to hear what the issues are and what is trying to be done to counteract that, because awareness about ageism and its links with abuse are critical importance going forward. As Veronica has said, please sign up to Take the Oath and to our newsletter, which as we go forward, we're trying to put out nation-specific newsletters from time to time, but the newsletters will always keep you up to date with what is happening, both within Hourglass and what we see as the key critical things that are happening within specific nations across the UK. Veronica has mentioned the training courses, which we have just recently started, and we've had a very positive response. So particularly for people who are working on frontline safeguarding services, it's something perhaps you would like to check out. And I do know that the next date coming up is the 7th of October, which is, and the training is around domestic abuse related deaths in later life, which is something that within Hourglass we are particularly concerned about. We're particularly concerned about the high femicide rate in Northern Ireland, because unfortunately the rate here is high compared to Western Europe. So it's something I think rightly we should be concerned about. So that training course I think would be very relevant. And then on the 4th of November, we have one on the economic abuse in later life, which again has been touched on this morning. So both of those are training courses, but our next open webinar, complimentary webinar, will be on the 20th of October, and it's in the afternoon from 3 to 4:30, and it's looking at the assisted dying bill considerations for later life, and again another area which Hourglass has been particularly interested in and concerned about, because of the need to have the appropriate safeguards in place while still giving older people, as every other person, that their individual choice. But we're just concerned about the safeguards that need to be there to protect people. Again, please follow us across all of our social media channels. We pop up everywhere, and we're keen for people to feedback whatever comments you have. And then just finally, the short survey, which everyone will be sent following this morning's webinar. It only takes a few minutes to complete, but I can assure you that in Hourglass, we review all of the surveys and take note of any comments, any suggestions for future webinars, any comments on how we maybe can improve on our webinars. We welcome all of those comments. So I think with that, we'll end this morning's webinar. And as Veronica said, thank you all for taking the time out of your very busy days to join us this morning. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in October. Many thanks.